Hi everyone, Jason here from Spiritual Babies. We're back with Rabbi Federow and I'm talking this week about Messiah, which is a heady topic. I encourage you all to go over to whatjewsbelieve.org, take a look at the fantastic essays that are there, and while you are there, buy the book Judaism and Christianity, A Contrast, which goes into a lot more detail than we can cover in these shows. Welcome back, Rabbi.
Thank you. It's good to be back with you.
So we've had some great response for the last 3 shows we've done, which is really great. Anyone listening, thanks for your replies, thanks for sharing, and thanks for the conversations on YouTube and on Facebook.
And Jason, let me reiterate something. They can always ask a question that we will try to answer in one of the later shows if they leave it in the comments.
Absolutely, yep. If you've got comments, leave them below. If you've got messages, you can leave them below. Or if you've got messages that you want to make maybe more privately, you can send them to either Rabbi Federow or to myself. So this week's topic is Messiah. There's an essay on your website, Jews Believe That Jesus Was Not the Messiah. And I just want to briefly start off by talking about a message I got last week where I was asked, so you don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah? And I said, well, absolutely not. And the response was, so you're still waiting for your Messiah? And that was said in the kind of way that all your problems are laid on your shoulders until your Messiah comes, but we have ours, and so we are clean and our sins are forgiven. So I think that might be a good place to start.
Yes, a very convenient belief to take the responsibility off the shoulders of the people who behave in whatever way they behave. They don't have to worry anymore because Jesus died for their sins.
Right, so we covered in show 1 and 2 the idea of a person not dying for another person's sin, and that kind of covers the whole sacrifice part of it. But if we were going to just nail it down, Tanakh is full of messiahs.
Absolutely. So you have to, first of all, you have to understand what the word Messiah means. Probably most people know this by now, but the word Messiah is an Englishization, whatever the term is, for the word Moshiach. Moshiach means anointed. Anointed, what exactly does it mean to be anointed? It means picked by God to do a specific task or tasks in the real world. So that when the priest anointed the king, it meant that God picked that person to be the king and to act as king towards God's subjects. And
that king needn't even necessarily be Jewish, right? We've got instances of foreign kings.
Cyrus of Persia was explicitly called the anointed one, okay, or an anointed one. You know, there's a difference between a Messiah, which means something or someone that has been anointed, and the Messiah, which is a term that explicitly is designated by Jewish tradition that we're really talking about when we're talking about the Messiah. You know, a human being born of 2 human parents who is picked by God to do very explicit things in the real world, the world that we can perceive with our own senses. But a Messiah, Jason, they anointed rocks when they made altars. They anointed utensils used in the temple. They anointed kings when they became king. They anointed priests when they became priests. It was a way of designating them as picked by God with an explicit set of tasks to do in the real world.
And they anointed even some of the temple offerings, right?
Absolutely.
And so if you like, there are 2 very different definitions of Messiah depending on what your perspective is. A Jewish person within Judaism would look at Messiah as being either the Messiah, we can get to that, or a Messiah.
Exactly. And the Jewish understanding of the term Messiah is a totally different understanding than the word Messiah and how it's used and understood within Christianity. And the way in which Christianity uses that term is diametrically opposed to what the Bible says, which we've discussed in previous shows. You know, they see Jesus as dying for your sin. The Bible explicitly says, Deuteronomy 24:16, every man shall be put to death for his own sin. They see Jesus as God incarnate. God promises us, Hosea 11:9, for I am God and not a man. Or Numbers 23:19, if I were a man, I'd be a liar because all men lie. Actually, when I tell that to people, the women giggle, the men look around like, what does that mean? But the women know that men are liars. But if God were to become a man, then like every man, God would be a liar too. So it's distinguishing between God being God and humans being humans, and God does not become a human and humans don't become God. Or they say that Jesus was the blood sacrifice necessary for the forgiveness of sin, Well, first of all, you don't have to have a blood sacrifice for the forgiveness of sin. And second of all, Jesus was a human being, and God calls human sacrifice an abomination, something he hates. And in Jeremiah, something that's so horrible it wouldn't even come into his mind to demand from people.
I suppose if we were going to put that into one big bracket, we'd still have to address the issue that within Judaism, the Messiah isn't expected to die for anybody.
Well, the Messiah, nobody can die for anyone else. You know, you're responsible for your own choices between good and evil. And a person who chooses to do evil, which we all do at some point in our lives, and it may not be evil, it may merely be bad, but we're still responsible, culpable for our own choices. The basic belief of Christianity and how they understand or define the term Messiah is diametrically the opposite of what the Bible says, and mutually exclusive to what Judaism believes, and basically is unbiblical at its base.
I guess if I was to approach a Christian and ask them what their concept of Messiah was, they would tick some of the same terms as a Jewish person might tick, but the concept behind those terms would be thoroughly different. So as an example, if I said to a Christian and to a Jew, is Messiah king? They'd both agree.
Yes, they would.
But in Judaism, that king has a physical throne in a physical place. He's doing actual real-world tasks. But the Christian concept would be a spiritual throne. It's like he'll be the king in the next room. You can't see what he's doing.
Jason, I think you have to realize that in the course of history, the earliest Christians believed that Jesus was going to be the Jewish Messiah with all of the Jewish understandings of what that term Messiah means. And when Jesus died on the cross, instead of doing all the things the real Messiah is going to do when he really comes, they had a choice. They could either say, oops, we backed the wrong guy, we were wrong, or they could redefine the term Messiah to fit the circumstances they were under so they wouldn't have to admit their mistake, and they could go ahead and continue believing in Jesus as this new concept of Messiah, which is what they did.
And I guess if we were going to run with that idea, then we'd have to say, well, why did Christianity flourish, a couple of hundred years after the death of Jesus? Why did it flourish? If the definition of Messiah would have been known by Jews at the time, and Jesus didn't match that, how did Christianity grow so fast?
Oh, that's a very simple explanation. First and foremost, remember, if you pick up the Christian's New Testament and look at where the disciples went in the book of Acts, they were mainly, not completely, but mainly at the port cities. Well, port cities is where people come and go all the time as they go deeper into the European and North African and Eastern Mediterranean continents. And so if you want to affect the most amount of people with the least amount of effort, you plant yourself where the most amount of people are going to walk by you, which would be the port cities.
And it would be fair to say that those people generally wouldn't be Jewish.
Generally, no, they would not be Jewish. But Jason, that's the thing. Everything they would hear the disciples preaching would not have been strange or unusual to them. I mean, think about it. They say, who is Jesus? And the Christian says, well, his mother was human and his father was God. Well, let's see. Hercules, whose mother was the human woman Alcmene and whose father was Zeus, or Dionysus, whose human mother was Semele and whose father again was Zeus, or Perseus, whose mother was Persephone, the human woman, and whose father again was Zeus. And as a matter of fact, it's very interesting because how did Persephone get pregnant by Zeus? Not through the act of sex, but rather Zeus showered her with gold and she became pregnant, which means she became pregnant without the act of sex, which is like a virgin birth. So none of the most basic elemental stories about the Christian Jesus would have been unusual to the ears of the heathens who would be listening to the disciples' messages. And so, of course, it's going to catch on because they've heard it before. It's nothing new to them. And if you go to the earliest Christian writings of Origen and Justin Martyr, what they both did was they wrote like a dialogue with people who didn't exist because they were putting into the mouths of the Jews in their text the common Jewish objections to Christianity, and then they were writing, as a response, the Christian response they wanted all Christians to learn when Jews would talk to them and give their objections. And both Origen and Justin Martyr, in their texts, one is contra celsum. Each Jew that they had, that they invented in their text, brings up the relationship of Jesus with Perseus and how similar they were. So again, nothing was new to the heathen, pagan, Hellenist, Phrygian, Mediterranean cultural idolatrous mind that Christianity would say. The difference, though, is that when Christianity attached itself to the Hebrew Scriptures, they could make it appear that their faith went all the way back to creation, which would have had a bigger impact on the pagan mind. Instead of merely believing in a Zeus making a human woman pregnant and giving birth to a demigod or god or whatever, they could now say, well, that religion, instead of starting with the pagan gods, started all the way back at creation, which was an advantage in their mind. So it's not surprising that Christianity caught on. It wasn't new to the heathens who became Christian.
A concept that was already thoroughly believed was just repainted and repackaged.
Absolutely. And remember something, Jason, much as I really hate to say this, Jews are not always religious. You have Jews in every generation for thousands of years who know more about the secular community than they do their own religion. And even 2014 years ago, give or take a few hundred years, you have Jews who knew more about Hellenism, about paganism, about idolatry than they did about Judaism, even though they were Jews. So of course it's going to attract, like today, Jews who really don't know that much about their own faith and their own religious tradition, their own history, their own theology, their own philosophy, their own Judaism. And so the earliest Christians, if you read the New Testament, the Christian New Testament, you will see that there are things embedded in the New Testament that show the ignorance of the Jews who were Christians. Okay, even Paul. Okay, interesting thing about Paul. Paul was from Tarsus, Saul of Tarsus. The patron god of Tarsus was Mithra. The coins made in Tarsus had their god Mithra coming out of a rock, like Jesus when he came out of the cave. And the parallels between Mithraism, the beliefs, the religion about Mithra, are so parallel to the beliefs about Christianity, about Jesus. Where do you think Paul got this from? He was from Tarsus, where the patron god was, let's see, born in the winter, died in the spring, came back to life 3 days later, and all who follow him have eternal life, immortality. Sound familiar? That's the reason why it caught on, and that's the reason why it spread so fast.
So we have the Christian perception of what Messiah means, which is effectively a repainting of pagan deities that effectively follow the sun around the earth.
Adonis, Dionysus, Attis, Ra, Mithra, Horus. I mean, any one of these pagan gods, these idolatrous gods, these dying, saving, pagan, idolatrous man gods, have elements that are so parallel to Christianity that the creators of Christianity basically followed through, put them all together, wrapped them up in one little package, and came up with Christianity.
When you look up crux on Vine's biblical dictionary, you find that it goes back to a small wooden T that the followers of Tammuz used to carry around. I find it very interesting that the crucifix that we associate with Christian jewelry is actually the T of Tammuz, and that's documented in Christian literature. I find that extraordinary that you can go out today and you'll see crosses on shirts and on jeans and on earrings and on necklaces, and they believe they're professing a symbol of their faith, but it's actually a much more distant faith.
What gets me about that is that they are turning into their jewelry the most horrific death penalty of that period.
So that is, in that period of time, that is what the Christians and the people that were being preached Christianity were told Messiah meant. But if we were to approach a person who followed Judaism in that same period, and we were to say, what are the requirements of being the Messiah, what would we hear from them?
All right, first of all, there are two elements. One is, who is the Messiah? What do we know about the Messiah? And the second element is, what does he do when he gets here? The first element is that the Messiah has to be a direct bloodline descendant from King David through King Solomon without going through Jehoiakim or his son Jeconiah or his son Shealtiel. A direct bloodline descendant, and by the way, that means through the Messiah's own biological human father. There are multiple verses in the Hebrew scriptures that indicate that the only group that has the legal biblical right to be a king are the direct descendants of King David, because God, through the prophets, promised King David that his throne will be established, his dynasty will be established forever. So the Messiah has to be a direct bloodline descendant of King David. Let me ask you something, Jason. Can I, Stuart Federow, be the King of England?
Not unless everybody else dies.
But that's the point. That's the point. In other words, I have no legal right to be King of England because I have no biological inheritance of that right. In the Bible, it says explicitly that God sends the prophet Nathan to King David and says to King David that Solomon, who will build the house in God's name, will be the next inheritor of the right of the throne of King David. So it's not only got to go through King David, it's got to go through King Solomon. Interesting to compare these elements with the Christian Bible, Christian New Testament, the Christian appendix to the real Bible, where the genealogies are listed in both Matthew and Luke. Someday we should do a show on nothing but the contradictions between the four Gospels. Really a few, because there are that many. But Matthew and Luke have the genealogies of Jesus. Both trace the lineages from either Adam or King David down to Joseph. But Joseph was not the biological human father of Jesus, which renders the genealogies to be irrelevant. But even if you took those genealogies seriously, there are problems in it. So, for example, we just talked about how the Messiah has to trace his lineage to King David through King Solomon, but according to the Gospel of Luke in the 3rd chapter, the genealogy of Joseph goes through Nathan, the brother of Solomon, and not Solomon. So to be the king of Judah, Jesus is disqualified, according to the Gospel of Luke, because his ancestor was not Solomon, but was rather Solomon's brother, Nathan.
So just that one thing alone would write him off as an option.
First thing that drops him off as an option is that Jesus' father was supposedly, according to Christian theology, God, and therefore he cannot trace his lineage back to King David. The second thing that knocks him off of the possibility of being the real Messiah is that, according to Luke, Jesus' genealogy is traced back through to Nathan, the brother of Solomon, when the Bible is explicitly clear the only legitimate heir to the throne of King David is King David's son Solomon. Okay, the third problem with the genealogies, according to Jeremiah, 22nd chapter, I believe, there's a king of Judah who was such a horrible king that God puts a curse on him and all of his descendants and says of him that no descendant of him shall inherit the throne of King David and rule over Judah again. And the Messiah, the real Messiah, will inherit the throne of King David and will rule over Judah because he rules over the earth. And so anybody who's a descendant of that man is disqualified as being the Messiah. It's talking about Jehoiakim. The descendant of Jehoiakim is Jeconiah. The son of Jeconiah is Shealtiel. And Shealtiel is listed in both Matthew and Luke's genealogy for Joseph, the not biological father of Jesus. So if we were to accept those genealogies as legitimate for Jesus, which we cannot because Joseph was not the biological father, but if we did accept them, he still has to be rejected because he is a descendant of a cursed line from King David.
I've read that Luke is considered sometimes to be Mary's.
But there's a problem with that. Read the Torah, the book of Numbers, chapter 1, I think it's the 2nd verse, when the listing, the genealogies, the lineages of the Jewish people are supposed to be recorded based on the paternal line. In other words, in Judaism, we understand Jewishness, which is inheritance of citizenship rights through the mother. But inheritance rights, like for tribal affiliation, possessions, is through the father. That's why every single genealogy in the Hebrew Scriptures, it's always through the father and only through the father. And if they happen to mention a woman, it's only because she was famous. But even if she was famous, the lineage goes through her husband, not her. That is also the same thing for the Christian New Testament as well. Every lineage in the New Testament, Matthew and Luke, list the genealogy again through the father. Matthew is so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, who was the father of so-and-so. Luke says so-and-so was the son of so-and-so, the son of so-and-so. So it's always the male line, as it's supposed to be. And again, if they mention a woman, it's because she was famous, but the lineage still goes through her husband, not her. So they knew and they admit and they accept that the lineages have to go through the father, because that's how they even list their own genealogies in Matthew and Luke.
I was going to ask, isn't there a connection between Mary and John the Baptist's parents?
Yes, actually. According to the Christian New Testament, Mary was a kinswoman of Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, and the New Testament text explicitly says that Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist, was a Kohen, a priest. And if they're kinswoman, it's not definite, but it's probable that that means Mary too was also a Kohen, a priest, and that's not the correct tribe. The tribe of King David was the tribe of Judah. So even if you said it was the genealogy of Mary, the fact that it's the mother and not the father means it doesn't matter what the genealogy says. Second thing is that even if you accepted the genealogy has the genealogy go through Nathan, the brother of Solomon, instead of Solomon. And third of all, even in the Luke text, Mary is not mentioned, and it says explicitly that Joseph was the father as was supposed. And why would it say as was supposed if it's not saying, it's not about Mary, it's about Joseph.
So the Messiah, according to the Tanakh, it will have human parents and will have a traceable genealogy that will take him back through his family line to through the line of David to get to David.
But he will
be a descendant of
through his
Solomon.
own biological father, without going through Shealtiel, Jeconiah, or Jehoiakim. He can trace his lineage back through King Solomon back to King David. And on every one of those points, Jesus fails. Now that's who the Messiah is going to be. But now we have to look at what is the Messiah going to do when the Messiah comes. Now remember something, Jason, and this is very important for people to understand. Every single thing the Messiah is supposed to do, the real Messiah will do when he comes, are perceivable and knowable with your own senses.
So what you're saying is there won't be any guesswork involved. You'll be able to look out your window, read your newspaper, it will be clear as day.
Exactly. And any human being on planet Earth can perceive these events with their own senses. It's not based on faith. Christians will say, well, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. That's one of the things that proves he's the Messiah. Well, I haven't seen a birth certificate. Have you?
And I imagine a lot of people were born in Bethlehem.
And a lot of people who are claimed to be messiahs, even in the Christian New Testament, were not born in Bethlehem. So it was never a Jewish idea that the Messiah had to be born in Bethlehem in the first place.
Also, I don't remember it being Jesus of Bethlehem.
Well, it's usually Jesus of Nazareth, which means that both Matthew and Luke have to invent a reason of why he was called Jesus of Nazareth, but in their mind, the Messiah had to be born in Bethlehem, so they have to invent a story of how Jesus was known as Jesus of Nazareth, but he was born in Bethlehem. So Luke has Jesus and Mary and Joseph start out in Nazareth, come down to Bethlehem, where Jesus is born, no room at the inn in a manger, and then after he's born, they go back to Nazareth on the flimsy excuse that, well, there was a census, and so they had to go to their hometown to be counted in the census. The interesting thing is that Matthew's version has them already in their home, in their hometown of Bethlehem. There is no need for a story of no room at the inn. There's no need for a story of being born in a manger because they're home. They're already in Bethlehem. So it doesn't say anything about having to have an inn or a manger because they're home already. They're in Bethlehem. And then it says, in order to fulfill a scriptural prophecy, they had to flee to Egypt. And when they came back from Egypt, they went up to Nazareth. The interesting thing is that if they went to Egypt in order to fulfill a prophecy, and going to Egypt is never mentioned in the book of Luke, then according to Matthew, Luke's version didn't fulfill a prophecy. And so according to Matthew, Luke's version should indicate that Jesus was not the Messiah because he never went into Egypt and then back out again.
The prophecy there is out of Egypt I've called my son.
Right, which is an explicit statement in Hosea chapter 11, which explicitly says, is talking about the people of Israel. And when Hosea says, when Israel was a child, and out of Egypt I called my son, what's that a reference to? When Israel was a child, remember something, until the Exodus from Egypt, the Jews were all descendants of the same family, but they had not unified. So the events of the Exodus from Egypt coalesced the Jews into a nation. And so coming out of Egypt was their childhood. And then when the text in Hosea 11:1 says, and out of Egypt I called my son, what's that all about? You have to go back to Exodus chapter 4, where God is telling Moses what to tell Pharaoh. And God tells Pharaoh, Israel is my firstborn son. Tell Pharaoh, let my people go, or I will kill his firstborn son, Pharaoh's firstborn son. So there you have a biblical reference of how God calls the Jewish people God's firstborn son, which is what Hosea was explicitly referring to in 11:1. He was explicitly talking about the people of Israel and their childhood as a nation, and how God called out his son, the Jewish people, from slavery in Egypt, and then coming out.
So that's a non-prophecy. I'm also reminded that the Messiah is supposed to have physical offspring to continue the line.
Absolutely. He's reestablishing the Davidic dynasty.
And clearly that didn't happen.
And clearly that didn't happen unless you believe, what's that book?
The Da Vinci Code. I mean, it's a commandment to go forth and multiply. So maybe he did. So point 7 on the essay: the Messiah brings eternal peace between all nations and all people. So again, this goes back to the clear and obvious arrival of the Messiah will with physical proofs.
Isaiah chapter 2 verse 2 through 4, Micah chapter 4 verse 1 through 4. It's also in Ezekiel 39. There's a story told in the Middle Ages when life was so horrible and the Jews were pleading, please God, give us our Messiah and give us relief. There were plenty of false messiahs coming around who really had followers, who really believed that the person they were following really was going to be the Jewish Messiah doing all the things that we're talking about. And there grew to be a kind of cynicism about the Messiah in the Jewish community. So you have such kind of stories. For example, or we talk about it at Tu B'Shvat every year, if you're in the process of planting a tree and someone comes up to you and says, the Messiah is here, come greet the Messiah, finish planting the tree first, then go greet the Messiah. In other words, it's a kind of gentle cynicism about messiahs because there were so many false messiahs coming around. There's a story told of a rabbi who was in his study and someone came in and said, Rabbi, the Messiah's come, the Messiah's here. He stands up, he looks out at the window, he sees two little boys fighting with each other, and he sits down and he says, call me when the real Messiah comes. In other words, it's not just nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore, which most people understand. It's also a peace between all people, and between all peoples hasn't happened yet.
It's interesting. I'm remembering verses from the New Testament which involve Jesus instructing the disciples to get swords.
Oh, absolutely.
I've come to place a sword between a father and a son and a mother and a daughter.
Which, by the way, is Malachi, the very last few verses in the book, where Elijah the prophet is supposed to come back and turn the hearts of the children to their parents and the hearts of the parents to their children. So Jesus is saying his point of coming is exactly the opposite of what Elijah the prophet will do along with the real Messiah. And so Jesus is basically saying, I'm not the Messiah and I know it.
And then obviously the temple was torn to the ground since the arrival of Jesus.
But don't ever underestimate the power of belief in the face of denial of events in history that should deny it. Just like when Jesus dies on the cross, instead of bringing about the Messianic age and all these things that we're talking about, they had a choice. They could shrug their shoulders and say, oops, we were wrong, or they could respond the natural, normal way that people respond when something they believe wholeheartedly in does not take place.
Also, I am I'm flicking through the list here of Messianic prophecy according to the Tanakh.
And remember, this is a short laundry list. There are elements to what the real Messiah will do when the real Messiah comes. And even Christians believe this is what the Messiah is supposed to do. The difference is that since Jesus didn't do it the first time around, they invent the idea of a second coming. So all this laundry list, oh yeah, sure, Jesus will do that when he comes back. But until then, you have to believe in Jesus doing all this other pagan stuff like dying for your sins.
So I think we can do a 2 for 2 here. We've got Zechariah 13:2. There'll be an end to idolatry. We've got Isaiah 11:9. There'll be a universal recognition of who Jewish idea of who God is, which reminds me of Jeremiah 31, which talks specifically about the new covenant and specifically that everyone will know who God is. And everyone will understand the law.
So what it says in 31:30 is that when this time comes, people are going to stop believing the stupid idea that someone else can die for your sin, and the whole world will understand everybody dies for their own sin.
And because we know that that's the case, then obviously there is still idolatry. People still have different ideas on who God is. Clearly, this new covenant hasn't come into effect yet.
Absolutely. And because it didn't happen when Jesus was here, that's why they invent the idea of a second coming. We invented the term Messiah. It's our term. It's about a Jewish man coming to the Jewish people based on the Jewish interpretation of the Jewish scriptures of the Tanakh, which is written in the Jewish language of Hebrew, where the Jewish interpretation is that based on the Tanakh, there are certain explicit things that the Messiah will do in the real world. It's our definition. They don't have the right to come to us and say, we've got the wrong definition because it's our word.
On the screen at the moment will be a list of other key areas and events that will happen. There'll be no doubt in your mind when these things occur. Study those out yourself. Have a look out your window and tell me if these things are happening. And if you have questions, please leave them below. I want to thank you again for spending some time with us today, Rabbi.
Oh, anytime, Jason. My pleasure.
And so get yourselves over to What Jews Believe and check out the website and check out the book, Judaism and Christianity, A Contrast. You can get it in hardback, softcover, and on all the e-formats, so you can download it onto all your tablets and phones and computers. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you again next week. Bye-bye.